Imagine flying a B-17, riddled with bullet holes, engines failing, deep in enemy territory. Most crews would bail out, but one bomber crew, against all odds, decided to do the impossible. This is the unbelievable true story of how they brought their crippled B-17 on a single engine all the way home. The sound of combat at 27,000 feet is not a roar, it is a scream. It is the screaming of wind tearing through jagged holes in aluminum. It is the screaming of superchargers fighting for thin air. And on December 20th, 1943, inside the cockpit of a B-17 Flying Fortress, it was the sound of a crew screaming against the dying light. 81 years ago, an impossible story unfolded in the frozen skies over Germany. It is a story that defies the laws of aerodynamics, the brutal logic of total war, and everything we think we know about the relationship between hunter and prey. This is the story of Ye Olde Pub, a B-17F that was shattered beyond recognition, and the rookie crew who refused to let her die. To understand the miracle, we must first understand the meat grinder. Late 1943 was a period known to the U.S. Army Air Forces as Black Week. The strategic bombing campaign against the Third Reich was reaching a fever pitch, but the cost was astronomical. The concept was daylight precision bombing. The Americans would fly during the day to hit specific industrial targets, while the British RAF bombed by night. The theory was sound, but the reality was a slaughterhouse. The Luftwaffe was far from defeated. On this particular morning, the target was Bremen, specifically the Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft factory. The irony was palpable. They were flying into the teeth of the enemy defenses to destroy the very machines that would rise up to kill them. The pilot was Second Lieutenant Charles L. Brown, Charlie to his friends. He was a farm boy from West Virginia, soft-spoken, only 21 years old. This was his first mission as an aircraft commander. His crew, the 10 men aboard Ye Olde Pub, were green. They had trained together, drank together, and bonded, but they had never looked down the barrel of the German flak batteries at Bremen together. They were flying a B-17F. For the aviation enthusiasts, the F model was a formidable beast, but it lacked the chin turret that would later appear on the G model to defend against head-on attacks. This detail would become horrifyingly relevant in the hours to come. As the 379th Bomb Group assembled over the English coast, the temperature dropped to 60 degrees below zero. At this altitude, if your heated flight suit failed, frostbite would claim your fingers in minutes. If your oxygen mask icing up, you would pass out in seconds and die in minutes. The environment alone was trying to kill them. Charlie Brown's plane was assigned a position known grimly as Purple Heart Corner. This was the low outside edge of the formation. It was the most exposed position, the first target for enemy fighters peeling off from the sun, and the last to receive overlapping covering fire from the rest of the squadron. As they crossed the Dutch coast, the flak began. Flak is an abbreviation for Vliegerabwehrkanoon, aircraft defense cannon. These were 88mm shells fused to detonate at specific altitudes. They didn't just explode, they filled the air with jagged, red-hot steel. 10 minutes before reaching the target at Bremen, the first disaster struck. An anti-aircraft shell burst right in front of Ye Olde Pub. The concussion rocked the 65,000-pound bomber like a toy. The shrapnel sliced through the cowling of engine number 2. Smoke began to trail instantly. Brown feathered the prop, turning the blades edge-on to the wind to reduce drag, and shut it down. Now they were flying on 3 engines. In a B-17, losing an engine means losing speed. To stay in the protective combat box formation, Brown had to throttle up the remaining 3 engines. But the drag was too great. Slowly, agonizingly, Ye Olde Pub began to slide backward. They were falling out of formation. They dropped their bombs over Bremen, successfully hitting the target area, but the relief was short-lived. By the time the bomb bay doors closed, They were a straggler. In the unforgiving arithmetic of the air war, a straggler is a dead man. They were alone in the German sky, wounded, slow, and broadcasting their position to every Luftwaffe fighter controller in the sector. The mission had just begun, and they were already a casualty waiting to happen. But the Luftwaffe wasn't going to wait. They were coming. What happened next was not a dogfight. It was an execution attempt. A squadron of roughly 15 German fighters, a mix of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, spotted the lone bomber. They recognized the kill immediately. A B-17 out of formation is like a wounded gazelle separated from the herd. They lined up for a synchronized attack. The F-model B-17 was vulnerable from the front, and the German pilots knew it. They came in head-on, their wing cannons flashing. A 20mm cannon shell smashed directly into the nose of Ye Olde Pub. It didn't just crack the plexiglass. It blew the entire nose cone away. Imagine driving a car at 250 miles per hour and having the windshield instantly vanish. Now imagine the temperature is 60 below zero. The hurricane-force wind blasted into the fuselage, pinning the bombardier and navigator against the bulkheads. The onslaught was relentless. Another pass took out the oxygen system. In a high-altitude bomber, this is usually a death sentence. Without supplemental oxygen, the crew began to suffer from hypoxia. Their vision narrowed, their judgment failed, and a euphoric lethargy set in. Engine number 4 took a direct hit. It surged wildly, vibrating so hard it threatened to tear the wing off. Brown had to throttle it back to almost nothing. Engine number 3 was hit next, damaged and spitting oil, losing power rapidly. So, let's take stock. Engine 2 is dead, Engine 4 is useless, Engine 3 is dying. Only engine number 1 is producing full power. A 4-engine heavy bomber was now essentially a single-engine aircraft. The defensive fire from Ye Olde Pub began to slacken. In the tail, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode was firing his twin .50 calibers continuously. He was the only thing keeping the fighters off their rear. Then, a German shell exploded directly in the tail section. The explosion killed Sergeant Eckenrode instantly. The tail gunner's position was obliterated. Up in the top turret, Sergeant Frenchy Coulombe's guns went silent. The hydraulic system had been shot out. Without hydraulics, the heavy turrets couldn't rotate against the slipstream. The B-17 was now defenseless. In the cockpit, Charlie Brown was fighting a losing battle against biology. A shard of shrapnel had hit him in the shoulder. The pain was dull, masked by the freezing cold and the hypoxia. He looked over at his co-pilot, Spencer "Pinky" Luke. Luke was slumped over the controls. The aircraft began to spiral. With the rudder controls damaged and the engines putting out asymmetric power, the B-17 rolled onto its back and entered a violent spin. The Earth, miles below, began to spin in the cockpit window, rushing up to meet them. As the plane plummeted, the change in altitude did one miraculous thing. The air got thicker. There was more oxygen. As they fell through 5,000 feet, the oxygen-rich air rushed into the shattered nose. Charlie Brown gasped. His brain snapped back online. He saw the ground rushing up, houses, trees, fields. He grabbed the yoke. He hauled back with every ounce of strength a farm boy from West Virginia could muster. The airframe groaned, rivets popped. The G-forces slammed them into their seats. At scarcely 2,000 feet, Ye Olde Pub leveled out. They had fallen nearly 5 miles. They were alive, but just barely. They were deep inside Germany, flying a plane that looked like Swiss cheese. The rudder was shredded, the port elevator was completely shot away. The nose was open to the elements, the radio was dead, the internal intercom was dead. 1 man was dead, and 3 others were severely wounded, and they were alone. Brown checked the throttles. Engine 1 was pulling the load. Engines 3 and 4 were barely turning, providing just enough thrust to counteract the drag of the dead number 2 propeller. He had a decision to make. The standard procedure for a plane this damaged was to bail out, but they were too low for parachutes. Even if they climbed, the wounded, Doc Sadok and Andy Andrews in the nose, couldn't jump. Brown looked at his co-pilot. He looked at the instrument panel. smeared with hydraulic fluid and blood. He made the impossible call. They weren't bailing out. They were going to try to fly this wreck back to England. Flying a B-17 on one good engine is a feat of physics that shouldn't work. The Boeing engineers who designed the Flying Fortress built it tough, but they never designed it for this. The drag was the enemy. Every hole in the fuselage, and there were hundreds of them, created turbulence. The missing nose cone acted like a giant air brake. To keep the plane in the air, Brown had to maintain a precarious balance of speed and lift. If he flew too slow, the wing would stall and they would crash. If he flew too fast, the vibration from the damaged engines would tear the aircraft apart. They were flying on the deck. Staying low helped them avoid German radar, but it exposed them to small arms fire from the ground. Soldiers with rifles, farmers with shotguns, everyone was taking pot shots at the massive, lumbering American bomber. Navigation was a nightmare. When the nose was blown off, the maps went with it. Doc Suddock, the navigator, was wounded and freezing, the wind chill essentially reducing the cockpit temperature to Arctic levels. He had to navigate by landmarks. A church spire here, a river bend there. They were looking for the coastline, hoping to orient themselves toward the North Sea. Communication was impossible. The intercom system had been severed. To check on the crew, men had to physically crawl through the fuselage. The floor was slick with hydraulic fluid and frozen blood. Sam Blackford, the ball turret gunner, had crawled up into the fuselage. His turret was jammed. He saw the carnage in the waist. The gunners were huddled together trying to keep warm, tending to the wounded. They injected morphine syrettes into the injured men, pinning the safety pins to their collars to mark the dosage, a grim standard operating procedure. The flight controls were mushy. The B-17 uses cables to move the control surfaces. Many of these cables were frayed. Brown had to wrestle the yoke constantly just to keep the wings level. It wasn't flying, it was a physical brawl with a 65,000-pound machine. They were limping at about 135 miles per hour. A healthy B-17 cruises at over 180. They were a sitting duck. And then the worst possible thing happened. They flew directly over a German airfield. On the ground, at Luftwaffe Airfield Jever, a pilot named Franz Stigler was refueling and rearming his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. Stigler was not a rookie. He was an ace. He had 27 confirmed kills to his name. He needed just 3 more to earn the Knight's Cross, the highest military honor in Germany. Stigler heard the roar of the B-17 engines. He looked up and saw Ye Olde Pub limping overhead, trailing smoke, barely clearing the hangars. Stigler didn't hesitate. He ordered his ground crew to pull the starter. The Daimler-Benz engine roared to life. He didn't even wait for his wingman. He taxied out and launched into the sky. For Charlie Brown and his crew, this was the end. They had no working turrets. They had no speed. They had no altitude. And now, one of the Luftwaffe's best hunters was rising to meet them. Franz Stigler climbed rapidly. His Bf 109 was a hawk chasing a wounded pigeon. He closed the distance in seconds. He leveled off behind the bomber's tail. This was the kill shot. A short burst from his nose-mounted cannon into the cockpit or the fuel tanks, and it would be over. The Knight's Cross was right there in front of him. Stigler placed his finger on the trigger. He squinted through the Reeve gun sight, but he didn't fire. As he got closer, Stigler saw something that made his blood run cold. He didn't see a machine. He saw a graveyard. The B-17 was a skeleton. The tail gunner's position was gone, literally blown away. Stigler could see the blood frozen on the jagged metal. He pulled up alongside the fuselage. The skin of the aircraft had been peeled back like a sardine can. Through the ribs of the airframe, he could see the crew huddled inside. He saw the frantic movement of men tending to the wounded. Stigler later said, "It was like seeing a man in a parachute. I simply could not shoot them down." Years earlier, Stigler's commanding officer in North Africa, Gustav Rodel, had told him, "You are fighter pilots first, last, always. If I ever hear of one of you shooting at someone in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." To Stigler, This B-17 was no longer an aircraft. It was a parachute made of metal. Charlie Brown turned his head and froze. There, not 20 feet off his right wingtip, was a German fighter. He yelled for his gunners to fire. "Top turret, get him!" But the reply came back. "Guns are jammed, Skipper." "Ball turret, track him." "No power, Skipper." Brown gripped the yoke, waiting for the muzzle flash. He waited for the end, but the German didn't shoot. Instead, Stigler nodded. Stigler made eye contact with Brown. He pointed down. He was signaling them to land. He knew they were critically damaged and wanted them to surrender in Germany, where they would receive medical attention. Brown shook his head. He wasn't landing. Stigler then pointed to the northeast. He mouthed the word Sweden. Sweden was neutral. It was a 30-minute flight. If they made it there, they would be interred for the war, but they would survive. Brown, confused and terrified, didn't understand. He thought the German was toying with him, a cat playing with a mouse before the kill. He kept flying due west, toward England, toward the Atlantic Wall. The coast of Europe was lined with Hitler's Atlantic Wall. This included arguably the densest concentration of anti-aircraft guns in the world. If ye old pub tried to cross that line low and slow, the ground gunners would shred what was left of them. Stigler realized the American pilot was insane. He was flying straight into a wall of fire, so Franz Stigler did the unthinkable. He didn't peel off. He tucked his wing in tight to the B-17. He flew formation. Why? Because German gunners on the ground were trained to recognize the silhouette of a Bf-109. If they saw a German fighter flying close escort with a B-17, they would hold their fire, assuming it was a captured plane or a secret mission. For several agonizing minutes, the two enemies flew side by side. The angel of death had become their guardian angel. They crossed the coastal batteries in silence. Not a single shot was fired from the ground. Stigler was using his own aircraft as a shield. Once they were over the open water of the North Sea, Stigler knew he had done all he could. If he went any further, he would risk running out of fuel or being intercepted by British Spitfires. He looked at Charlie Brown one last time. He raised his gloved hand to his brow. A salute. Then he banked his fighter away and vanished into the clouds. Charlie Brown slumped in his seat. He didn't know who that man was. He didn't know why he was still alive. But he knew one thing. They still had 250 miles of freezing ocean to cross on one engine. The encounter with Stigler was surreal, but the danger was far from over. The North Sea is a graveyard for aircraft. The water temperature is near freezing. Survival time in the water is measured in minutes. Ye old pub was losing altitude. The strain on the single good engine was becoming critical. The oil pressure was dropping. The cylinder head temperatures were spiking. To stay in the air, they had to lose weight. Brown ordered everything overboard. And I mean everything. The machine guns were unbolted and tossed out the waist windows. Ammo belts followed. Flak jackets, radios. Even the Norden bomb sight, a top-secret piece of technology that crews were sworn to protect with their lives, was hurled into the sea. They stripped the plane to its bones. They gained a few hundred feet of altitude, just enough to keep the waves from licking the belly of the aircraft. For an hour they flew in silence, listening to the engine sputter. Then, through the mist, a shape appeared. Land. England. They had crossed the impossible distance. But they weren't safe yet. They needed an airfield. Brown couldn't make it back to their home base at Kimbolton. He needed the first strip of concrete he could find. They spotted the airfield at Seething, home of the 448th Bomb Group. Brown approached the tower. He had no radio to call for clearance. He fired a red flare, the universal signal for wounded on board. As he lined up for the runway, Brown went to drop the landing gear. Nothing happened. The hydraulics were gone. The crew had to manually crank the gear down. It was a grueling mechanical process, turning a heavy crank by hand while the plane buffeted in the wind. They managed to get the wheels down and locked just seconds before touchdown. But without hydraulics, they had no brakes. The tires screeched against the tarmac. Ye olde pub roared down the runway, refusing to stop. It passed the control tower. It passed the hangars. It ran off the end of the runway, plowed through a field, and finally came to a halt near a line of trees. Silence. For the first time in hours, the roaring of engines stopped. The screaming of the wind stopped. The crew sat there for a moment, stunned. Then they began to scramble out. They pulled the wounded, Doc Suddock and Andy Andrews, onto the grass. They counted heads. 9 men alive, 1 dead. The ground crews from Seething rushed out to the plane. They stopped in their tracks when they saw it. The B-17 was unrecognizable. It had over 3,000 bullet holes. The tail was hanging by a few shreds of metal. The nose was gone. The wings were tattered. It looked less like an airplane and more like a collection of scrap metal flying in close formation. The base commander looked at the plane and reportedly said, "How the hell did that thing stay in the air?" Charlie Brown was debriefed immediately. He told the intelligence officers everything. He told them about the flak, the fighters, and the dive. And he told them about the German pilot, the one who saluted. The reaction from the high command was swift and shocking. They ordered Brown and his crew to never speak of the incident. They classified the report secret. Why? Because the logic of war is brutal. The brass didn't want Allied crews to think that the Germans might show mercy. If American pilots hesitated to shoot because they hoped for chivalry, they would die. They wanted the enemy to remain a faceless monster. So, for 40 years, Charlie Brown kept the secret. He went back to war. He flew 25 more missions. But he never forgot the eyes of the man who spared him. In 1986, retired Lieutenant Colonel Charlie Brown began searching for the man who saved him. He placed ads in German combat pilot newsletters. In 1990, he received a letter from Canada. It read, "I was the one." Franz Stiegler had moved to Vancouver after the war. The two men met in Seattle. They didn't shake hands. They hugged. They cried. They remained best friends until their deaths in 2008, just months apart. This story tells us 2 things. First, it is a testament to the B-17 flying fortress. No other aircraft in history could have absorbed that level of punishment and kept flying. It was a marvel of American engineering, rugged, redundant, and refusing to quit. It brought 10 men into hell, and it brought 9 of them home when physics said they should have died. But more importantly, it is a story about the stubborn persistence of humanity. War is designed to strip away our humanity. It turns people into targets. It turns killing into a job. But on December 20th, 1943, amidst the total brutality of the air war, 2 men chose a different path. Charlie Brown refused to give up on his crew, fighting a shattered machine with every ounce of his strength, and Franz Stiegler refused to surrender his soul to the swastika painted on his tail. He chose the code of the warrior over the orders of his government. In the end, the bullets didn't win, the flak didn't win, the hatred didn't win. What won was a single silent salute over the North Sea. If you enjoyed this story of impossible survival, make sure you're subscribed. We dig deep into the archives to bring you the stories they didn't teach you in school. And I want to hear from you. Do you think Stiegler was right to spare the bomber, knowing it would likely return to bomb his country again? Or was it a dereliction of duty? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies.